what is a rolling research program? So, welcome, Michele.
Hi, everyone. I'm super happy to be here. Thanks for having me. So the UXDX team asked me to talk about rolling research, and I'm prepared to share a ton about it with you. I'm going to go ahead and start my slideshow here. Hopefully you can see the cover slide. Can I get a confirmation that we're good
Yeah,
to go here?
everything's looking good and you're good to go.
Awesome. And I've also created some resources for you as well. So if we could share our resources, that'd be great. For those of you that might not know me, my name is Michele Ronsen. I'm a user research executive coach and educator. Um, I teach people around the world how to break into the field, how to upskill. I do a ton of corporate trainings and team trainings. I am a classically trained designer that moved into research about 12 years ago. And I founded my latest firm, Curiosity Tank, about 4 years ago with the explicit purpose to help people learn how to ask better questions and make more confident decisions. Super grateful for LinkedIn. LinkedIn named me a top voice influencer in 2020, the first user researcher ever. So I communicate a lot on LinkedIn. I'm super passionate about user research. And I'm also a practicing researcher. So, for context, here are some of the questions that I'm asked to explore most frequently. And this will set the stage for our conversations today as they relate to rolling research, because rolling research typically only relates to evaluative questions. What we have here are both evaluative and generative questions. So, generative research questions typically happen in the beginning of the product development or service development cycle, and evaluative research questions occur once we actually have something to evaluate. I also lead a program called Ask Like a Pro, in which I take user researchers through every single phase of the design process and mentor them and provide guidance as they're working on actual research projects. So you may hear me refer to a lot of things in terms of Ask Like a Pro, and some of the resources that I shared with you come from the Ask Like a Pro learning and training series. And if you haven't had a chance, you'll want to download these resources, because there's also an hour-and-a-half event focused specifically on rolling research. And it's a panel discussion where I've invited the leaders of the rolling research programs from Zillow and Pinterest and Google and Roku, and you can hear firsthand about their programs as well. So, what is rolling research? In a nutshell, it's an iterative method. It's a continuous approach where we're conducting studies on a regular, ongoing basis. Um, Typically, we're conducting studies, or I would say more frequently, teams are conducting studies with distinct start and stop times. Rolling research occurs on a regular cadence. It can usually follow the same product or service throughout the development life cycle, or it can rotate from question to question or team to team. But it's hugely beneficial. Mostly more UX mature teams have rolling research programs in development, but it really allows for super in depth understanding over a period of time continuously. Super well suited for agile teams because it continually gathers feedback, and then the teams incorporate it into the design or the development process iteratively. And rolling research can be applied or implemented through a variety of methods. And I'm going to get more into this a little bit later. And the frequency varies depending upon the needs of the team or the organization or what's being developed. The most common experience I have personally with rolling research and developing rolling research programs is on a weekly cadence. As you'll hear from the other experts I had the panel discussion with, it fluctuates from weekly to twice a month to 2 weeks on to 2 weeks off to monthly. None of them were actually running it on a quarterly basis, but some people might consider rolling research for, say, like NPS scores or something like that, CSAT scores. That also can sometimes be referred to as rolling research, but that's not really what I'm going to talk to you about today. Rolling research on a weekly or bi-monthly or even monthly basis requires a super clear structure, flexibility, and adaptability. And we need all those things in place in order for it to be deployed successfully. The most common thing about rolling research is that it uses the same something, right? It uses either the same methodology, the same recruiting approach, the same schedule, or the same output. And it's usually a combination of these things so that we can do it week after week after week and keep delivering on it. So something is consistent, and that consistency is required for us to be predictable and to time it in order to commit and deliver on this rolling rhythm. And I'm going to give you some more examples about that. The most common thread here, again, is predictability, right? So the program structure, the program cadence, the type of questions rolling research programs can explore, who they explore them with, etc., really vary. But it's the predictability that's the most common thread. So what questions does rolling research explore? Typically, it explores evaluative questions, right? Some examples of evaluative questions would be what you see here. So this is evaluative questions in terms of there is something for the respondents to evaluate. The product or service has been developed to a point where there is either a storyboard or a paper prototype or even a low or high fidelity prototype, or those are all visual stimuli, but sometimes maybe it's going to be audible stimuli. Think about like a call script or a VRU or a conversation with Alexa or Alexa telling you a joke or something like that. So it can be audible, it can be visual, or it can be literal. Also, it could be product description or write-up or a comparison of different products and services according to maybe different tiers of service. So the stimuli itself can also vary depending upon the team, but we typically are including evaluative questions in rolling research because it's more tactical. So, what kinds of participants are included? This is a really good question and one that I field a lot about. And the truth is that it can include all types of participants, all types of segments. But recruiting is definitely a significant consideration when building a rolling research program because you need to have those people like ready at within arm's reach to be solicited and recruited and scheduled on that weekly or bi-monthly or monthly basis. So recruiting's a challenge to definitely consider when you're building any sort of rolling research program, but there's many ways to resolve this. As I've explored my own solutions and as I've had conversations with many other teams about how they go about this as well. I'm happy to answer any specific questions too. People also ask which stakeholders are involved and how. And I hate to say it varies, but I didn't. I said it depends, which is also true. So the stakeholders who are involved in the rolling research program also vary by team, as is the person who's leading the study. Sometimes there's a dedicated rolling researcher that is focused 100% on the rolling research program. Sometimes it's a staff researcher, and staff researchers roll in and out, or they'll do like 1 month on, 3 months off, 1 month on, 3 months off, and it kind of rotates through the team. Other times there might be a research contractor that's dedicated to it. In other instances, other disciplines or other functions are running rolling research. And those are scenarios in which we're training designers or PMs or engineer, sales, L&D, marketing. Also, the stakeholders themselves can vary, because those are the people who are bringing the questions forward for exploration. So the question sets themselves might arise from the design team or the product team or the eng team or marketing, whomever. So that also influences the stakeholders that are involved. Stakeholder expectations also vary widely. I know sometimes teams often require like a research sponsor or a research lead to oversee the work if it's not being run through the research program. There may be a um, research lead or a research sponsor to make sure that the questions are the right size and that they are appropriate for the rolling research program, that they align towards the broader goals, and they also help ensure quality work. But the stakeholders themselves can represent different functions um, in the organization as well. I know some programs require stakeholders to contribute at a certain level. Some of them say may be required to watch all of the sessions live or participate in debrief sessions. So the program structures really vary, and as well as the stakeholder expectations and who the stakeholders are, as well as who is leading the research. There's no one right formula. The formula itself is going to be highly dependent upon the culture in which you're operating in, the resources, the talent and skills, the commitment, the adaptability, the flexibility, the team, the project, and things like that. So there's many different benefits and drawbacks to rolling research. I love developing, designing, deploying, and conducting rolling research. It's super quick. You get a tremendous amount of impact versus the time invested. I love the predictability of it. My stakeholders love the predictability of it. It's a terrific approach to align the team to a very specific timeline. The deliverables tend to be much leaner than in a typical research project. And by the deliverables, I mean the final outputs. I love the fact that it's repeatable, it's informative, and it has a templated process. Now, again, that process is going to vary a little bit from team to team, but it's also a terrific opportunity for new researchers to break into the field. It's a terrific opportunity for new researchers to implement on a lot of different studies very quickly, which will then expedite their learning. It will increase their experience, and they're able to see how the learnings are applied very quickly. So you think about any researcher, let alone a new researcher, conducting rolling research for, say, 6 months. I mean, they could easily have 18 studies under their belt in that amount of time. And that's just a tremendous amount of experience to acquire in such a small amount of time. Some of the cons that come with rolling research programs are that it's difficult for a single researcher to maintain this over a long period of time. There's a lot of burnout. So I know some teams build in blocks of time for like recovery, or they build in after X amount of rolling research studies, they roll onto a different type of study, which will have a different methodology to it. Right. There's somewhat of a lack of variety in terms of the methodology because most of the questions are also evaluative. There's also a lot of context switching. You could be running a project for a different team or on a different product or feature every week or twice a month. So you're constantly like acquiescing to your environment, which I think is super fun, but that is not necessarily a good fit for everyone. Another consideration is the person who's conducting the rolling research really needs to acquire a certain degree of methodological expertise. And this is really in lieu of subject matter expertise because the subject can change every week, right? So again, it's not really for everyone. It's not necessarily a good personality fit. It's not a good pace fit. I think it's totally fun. I think it's a great way to explore, try new methods, improve your skills, increase your pace. And also a great exercise, especially for academics looking to transition into industry, because the pace is so different and rolling research requires you to be so much more succinct in your communications and your outputs. As I mentioned earlier, there are some recruitment constraints. You need some recruitment support in place, whether that is a dedicated recruiter internally or externally, or a participant pool that you can regularly draw from. But all of these things have certainly been resolved at many teams around the world. And you also want to ensure that just because you're conducting rolling research, and rolling research by nature is lean, you want to make sure that lean doesn't mean superficial and that action is indeed taken. So here's a quick overview on some of the pros and cons of rolling research. And I mentioned also quite a variety in terms of structure, in terms of benefit, in terms of stakeholders and methodologies. Um, the variations themselves differ in terms of the methods that are acceptable to one program versus another, recruitment processes and approaches, also the outputs. The outputs are much leaner than typical research studies, but the deliverable type and the fidelity can also really vary. Some teams I know have a specific number of participants or a specific number of questions that they will not exceed. So, for example, we'll speak with 5 people each week, and we'll ask them 5 questions max. So, in terms of quantity of participants and questions, there are some variables there. I talked a little bit about the resources and how to resource a rolling research program. I've seen dedicated staff, I've seen shared and vary staff, I've seen rotations, contractors. Sometimes senior talent is leading the rolling research program, sometimes junior talent, sometimes the studies are blind, sometimes they're branded. Also, the stakeholders themselves and the expectations and their requirements um, can also differ quite a bit. In addition, each team has its own, kind of culture, and each industry has its own culture. So there are some cultural differences as well. And the intake process, right? How will you accept or evaluate or vet whether or not something is appropriate for user research, and that team and that particular method, recruitment, output, resource, things like that also varies. But there are a lot of similarities too. As I mentioned earlier, stakeholders are critical, right? How and when stakeholders contribute to the process does vary, but there always needs to be a stakeholder. And there's always repeatable processes that are in place. These repeatable processes typically include the research question or size, the scheduling and the recruitment, alignment with a sprint, how someone signs up or gets into the queue, how it's vetted, what's discussed. There are typically very stringent cutoff dates to get the stimuli into the rolling research program. Um, Stakeholder involvement is always required to some degree, and the outputs. Right? So again, the outputs can really vary as well. So, what do rolling research outputs look like? I mentioned they're typically a little bit leaner. Okay. So, I've shared with you here some of my simplified deliverable from rolling research programs that I have run. So, what you see here is I ran a concepts study. I had 5 concepts for the redesign of a healthcare website, the desktop experience. And I ultimately built this program out. We ran over 180 studies in 18 months. in a rolling research program. So we were conducting 1, 2, or 3 studies a week across 4 segments to develop it from these were 2 of the initial 5 concepts all the way through to handoff to the development team for every single part of the website. So for instance, I would conduct research on Thursdays. I would analyze and synthesize on Fridays. I would present very lean deliverables to the design team and the eng lead on Mondays. This is an example of my visual markups. This is what I would present. Monday evening, we would decide what we were going to test the following Thursday. Tuesday, I would begin my recruit. Wednesday, I would author my discussion guide and schedule, and designs were due Wednesday night for Thursday testing. So it's very, very quick. And it's enormous. The impact of this is just enormous. Now, for the client, I were deliverables like this, right? So what you see on the left was week 1. You can see the date here is October 13th, 2015. This was 7 years ago, almost 8 years ago for my first rolling research program. Week 2, you see what we tested, the key takeaways, and the date there is April 21st. Okay. Week 3, oops, I think I went backwards. There we go. And we're progressing in fidelity as we move through the product development cycle. But again, these deliverables are extremely simplified. You have to simplify something, a lot of things actually, in order to deliver on that cadence. So the outputs vary, but they're going to be consistent within the team. I know some teams have like a strict 9-slide format, and it includes very specific things. Other teams use only a top-line report, but they have very specific consistency in other areas. My preference has always been visual markups because I work really closely with the designers, and that's a very easy way for me to communicate what's working well, what's not, what's resonating, where are the opportunities, what we might want to explore or do differently. And there's lots of other variables as well. So, does rolling research make sense for your organization? That's going to depend, right? It's going to depend on whether your team has the structure or the wherewithal to develop the structure, the discipline, what sort of guardrails you're going to put in place, like what will the rolling research program be built to handle and what will it not? There's also talent required to conduct the studies. Clearly, someone with rolling research experience before or previously will be in a better position to build a rolling research program because they have some sort of transferable knowledge, but not necessarily maintain the program. And those could be 2 separate people. You also want stakeholder buy-in, and there needs to be like a real commitment to execute on the learnings. Some sort of recruitment process is going to be required in order for you to deliver on the cadence and adaptability. So those are just of the few things that I would encourage you to consider if you're interested in building rolling research at your organizations. I know that all of these companies have really robust rolling research programs. It's something very popular. The impact is enormous. The progress and the iterative nature, you really can't get any better, right? You really can't get any better than building a rolling research program to align the team and to get everybody on the same page and commit to deadlines and improving and iterating in the same cadence. So again, here are some resources that I put together for you guys. I invite you to look at it. There's also a link in there to the 1.5, 2-hour discussion, panel discussion with rolling research leaders from other organizations. And I invite any sort of questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Michele. That was really, really interesting. I enjoyed the kind of digging into all the pros and cons as well, because it's great just saying everything's perfect, but in reality, there's always challenges.
There are enormous challenges to building a rolling research program. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So, yeah, if anybody has any questions, I know some people were posting some from the last session, so please do post in whatever platform you're in. But I had one or two questions coming out of that
Yeah,
I'd love to dig into. So,
sure.
um, if I start with the one in continuous discovery habits, Teresa Torres talks about automating your kind of ways that you can try automate the people, your recruitees or interviewees.
Mhm.
And one challenge that I've always seen faced by teams is it's kind of difficult that if you give that structure where you're always doing your testing on a Thursday or something, so you're trying to minimize the context switching too much for the team by having it on a set date. How does that work with customers' availability? Because maybe the customers don't work with that. So how do you balance those two kind of competing, what the customer's availability is and then the context switching of the team?
Well, again, like the repeatable nature of a rolling research program is um, it's paramount. You have many more customers than you do rolling researchers or rolling research projects. So that's why building a recruitment strategy and a recruitment approach that is going to allow you to deliver on whatever cadence your team has set up is so important. So in my instance, for the healthcare organization, I built my own participant pool and I continued to feed the pool constantly, week after week after week, with new questions. And I was thinking 4 weeks in advance, what are we going to want to learn about then? Okay, we're going to want to get feedback from people who have chronic conditions. We're going to want to get feedback from healthcare brokers. We're going to want to get feedback from people who are healthcare proxies because we were testing all of these different things in the site as we developed it. So you're constantly like thinking ahead to build your pool so that you have the right people to tap into when you need it. Be my That's what's worked
Excellent.
out.
And
Yeah.
just on that, with all of the different kind of styles of people or personas or whatever use cases,
Mhm.
do you mix your generative with your evaluative? Because I guess, as you kind of mentioned, there is the generative usually happens earlier, but I think there's some good value in just kind of trying to understand generative throughout a kind of a
Mhm.
unstructured kind of learning throughout the project. So how do you, or what's your approach to trying to mix a little bit of generative and evaluative? Do you do them in the same session or very much separate sessions?
I think that is going to be really dependent on what the question set is. If the question, the overarching question is really what's working well and what's not, that's purely evaluative. If the question set is what's working well, what's not, and how can we improve it, then there's, typically some more generative questions in there. I have no problems working on that. Simultaneously, one of my favorite questions or question sets to explore is, are we building the right thing versus are we building the thing right? And those are two very different questions. Um, so in the rolling research programs that I've built and the studies that I've conducted, I am very comfortable jumping, to both sides, provided, of course, everything is happening according to that, very structured approach. If I have the questions on Monday, I can, draft the discussion guide on Tuesday, recruit on Wednesday, get the stimuli Wednesday night, test on Thursday. So as long as it's meeting the schedule, um, I that to me like is one of the most fun parts because that introduces more variety. And it
Excellent.
also allows you to explore, and just flex kinda different muscles. Yeah. But some programs would say, "No, we only do evaluative. We only do, X or Y."
Brilliant.
So
All right, well, that actually brings us to time. But if anybody has any questions, please do keep sending them in and we'll put those through to Michelle on the Slack group. But that's it for tonight. So thank you very much, Michelle.